In part three of this presentation on race in American history, I'd like to focus on the period after World War II, because that's when the civil rights movement was born. Let's look at some major milestones of the movement. There's an entire course on the civil rights movement, and I would encourage you to take it. So this will be brief, but it will, I hope, put things in context. In 1948, President Truman ordered desegregation of the military. The armed forces were segregated during the war, and he put an end to that in 1948. Congress never would have gone along with it because of opposition from the South, but this was within his power as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. There are lots of other milestones, but let me single out one of the most important ones. It's the case of Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. What this did was disallow the segregation of public schools in the United States. The key legal figure, there were two key legal figures here. One was Thurgood Marshall, the lead plaintiff attorney representing the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And the other was the new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren. And they were pioneers in creating this legal change in the basis for looking at race in the law. The following year, 2 years, there was a more popular movement led by Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. And this, of course, is the famous Montgomery bus boycott. I'm sure you're familiar with it, when Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. In 1957, there was the Little Rock school desegregation case. This was 3 years after the Brown versus Board decision, but Little Rock, Arkansas had still not desegregated schools. And it was necessary for President Eisenhower, who did this reluctantly, but who did it. He sent the armed forces into Little Rock to make sure this happened. And there was intense opposition. In 1960, sit-ins began at lunch counters, and they made use of the philosophy of Martin Luther King that involved nonviolent civil disobedience. They simply sat at segregated lunch counters, a mixture of African American and white protesters, and they forced police to physically carry them out, but they did not engage in violence. There was a lot of training involved in this, and it was a very successful campaign. In Nashville, Tennessee, among other cities. The Freedom Riders applied the idea of integration on buses, the same principle that Rosa Parks had worked for, but they applied it to interstate buses. And they needed federal protection against acts of violence. Freedom Summer in 1964 was an attempt to, work for the right to vote, for voter registration. And this involved violence as well. 3 civil rights workers were killed in Mississippi over this issue. In 1964, under President Lyndon Johnson, the landmark Civil Rights Act was passed, and that remains one of the cornerstones of civil rights legislation in the United States to the present day. This guaranteed equal accommodations in employment, although that was difficult to enforce and remains so, but in things like hotels and restaurants and theaters, it was now against the law to require segregation. This was a major blow against the Jim Crow system. The following year, after the Selma to Montgomery March, which again involved violence, The Voting Rights Act was passed, and that remains an important piece of legislation, although in more recent times, unfortunately, it was gutted by the U.S. Supreme Court. The South's response to the civil rights movement was intense, it was bitter, and it was often violent. You can go on, if you look at the PDF version of this presentation, you can find a link to the Southern Poverty Law Center's listing of racially motivated murders. The list is long and appalling. I would encourage you to look at that. And there were countless other violent acts, short of actually murder, that terrorized civil rights workers. There were arrests, there were jailings, there were refusals to comply with court orders. Job holders who participated in civil rights actions were sometimes fired. For example, those who signed as plaintiffs in the Brown versus Board of Education case in a place like Clarendon County, South Carolina, were fired, often fired from their jobs. They paid a huge price for their decision to stand up for justice and to make use of the legal rights that they were guaranteed as Americans. And politicians in the South who favored these violent responses, intense resistance to civil rights, were typically reelected, usually by wide margins, because, of course, the great majority of voters who could actually cast ballots were white, and they were, by and large, extremely opposed to civil rights. You see things like, dogs being used, fire hoses being used, but one of the differences here is that these tactics were shown on television. This was the era of television news, and people around the country could see this. And any fair-minded person had to be appalled by what was going on in the South. No longer was it being done in secret. Now, after the victories of the 1960s in the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act of the mid-60s, there was a new strategy that was not so direct. It was known as the Southern strategy, and it involved dog whistle racism. This means claiming that other factors were really the reason when really racism was the reason. This is once again another attempt to renew that old psychology that had been around all the time throughout American history since Bacon's Rebellion. The idea of dividing people along lines of race rather than class. The Republican presidential nominee in 1964 was Barry Goldwater, who had voted against, he was a senator who had voted against the Civil Rights Act of '64. And even though the South had a long tradition of being the so-called solid South for the Democratic Party, Goldwater won the deepest of deep Southern states. Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina, Georgia. And in every other part of the country he lost. But here he won. And this was a sign of the political transformation of the South from Democratic to Republican. Now, in 1968, 4 years later, George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, realized that he could code racial appeals. He could speak language that blew dog whistles. He could talk not directly. He grew up in when he was inaugurated governor of Alabama in 1963. He famously said, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. But by 1968, he realized that he had to speak a different language, but he could communicate the same messages. So he began to talk about law and order and opposing forced busing, things like that. And he found that he could gain a lot of support in the North as well as the South. Now, the man in 1968 who more effectively made use of that Southern strategy was Richard Nixon. And he spoke about law and order, for example. But that was code language. And he ended up winning the 1968 election using language like that. And again, in the PDF version, you can get, there's a very good video that explains how he accomplished that. Now, that kind of tactic has gone on. Ronald Reagan used it in 1980 when he opened his campaign in Neshoba County, Mississippi, the same location as the murder of the civil rights workers 16 years earlier. And what did he say when he went there? He spoke in favor of states' rights. That was code. It was dog whistle language to mean the South should be free to do whatever they wanted to do. That would be the white South. Now, in more modern times, there were many attempts to limit the influence of minority votes. And we could lump these under the heading voter suppression. Now, these are just some of the tactics that have been used. It's a long list. Republicans realize that they are losing the demographic battle. Population shifts are not working in their favor. So they're using other tactics to try to maintain political control. For example, demanding photo IDs with the knowledge that poor people are less likely to have them. This hadn't been the case before, but these are new restrictions on the right to vote. In one notorious case, they demanded in South Dakota that voters have street addresses if they were going to register to vote. Well, Native Americans on reservations don't have street addresses. This was clearly an attempt to suppress their vote. They would reduce the number of state offices where one could register to vote in poor neighborhoods, making it more difficult, especially for those who didn't have cars to register to vote. They limited early voting and voting hours. And even today, they have resisted attempts to do things like create weekend voting. All in an attempt to limit the size of the vote. They limited sometimes the number of poll workers and polling places in poor and minority neighborhoods, resulting in long lines, hoping, of course, that some people would give up and would not wait it out so they actually got the opportunity to vote. Gerrymandering, redrawing congressional and state legislative districts to exaggerate the electoral influence of whites. And more on this in a minute. Purging voter rolls of those who did not vote in the last election or whose registration showed slight, trivial discrepancies. Georgia was notorious for this under Governor Brian Kemp. Denying the right to vote for citizens convicted of a felony, even years after their release from prison, sometimes denying that right to vote for life. Now let's look at racial gerrymandering. North Carolina is notorious for this. This is a map of a legislative district, what you see in brown, of the 12th Congressional District in North Carolina. This is not a shape you see in nature. It was drawn specifically, indisputably, to try to group African American voters into one district. And this gets to the two parallel techniques involved in gerrymandering. One is called packing. That's what's illustrated in this map here. To crowd as many minority voters into one congressional district so that they will readily grant that the representative of that district will most likely be an African American, but then they will prevent those voters from having an influence in other districts nearby. Now, along with that, there's also cracking, which means scattering other minority voters into multiple districts so that the influence of white voters is magnified. And this has a measurable effect on the representation in state legislatures and in a state's congressional delegation. So commonly, even though a majority of voters in that state may have voted Democratic, the majority of the congressional delegation or the state legislature would be Republican. Now, the Supreme Court struck down the North Carolina law, and one conservative justice, Clarence Thomas, sided with the four more liberal justices. The long-term prospects of racial gerrymandering are still unclear, and it remains a major problem. Now, let's touch on felon voting laws. This is a map produced by the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. Now, those states in red ban people permanently from voting if they've had a felony conviction. Even something like a drug possession conviction when they were 18 years old, that means they can't vote for the rest of their lives. Now, in one of these three states, Virginia, allows the governor to waive that restriction for individual voters, and the governor of Virginia, a Democrat, has waived it for over 150,000 voters there. But the law remains on the books, and with a different governor, the response, I'm sure, would be different. If you look at the states in yellow or orange, they tend to be the more restrictive states. And guess what? They're disproportionately represented in the South. Let's talk about one state in particular, namely Florida. Florida was bright red on earlier maps, but in 2018, Florida changed that. Until then, Florida felons were denied the right to vote for the rest of their lives, and that denied about 1.5 million Floridians the right to vote. Now, this was absolutely decisive in the election of 2000, which was decided by 537 votes. Had felons had the same right to vote that they have in most other states, Al Gore would have won Florida and would have won the election. I think there's no doubt about that. Now, in 2018, Florida voters ended this system of felon disfranchisement by a majority of almost 65%. But the Republican legislature was not finished. The legislature, and with the support of the governor, passed a law, and the voting was strictly along party lines, requiring ex-felons to repay fines and court fees left over from their convictions before voting. So, for example, of course, these are people who are almost always poor. Their lives have been disrupted by being in prison, after all. One woman, for example, was convicted in 2005 of grand theft. That's 15 years ago, and identity misuse, and was ordered to pay back $190,000 before she could vote. The intent of this is crystal clear. They want to suppress the votes of anyone who might vote for the party they don't like. Now, I don't mean to suggest that the Republicans are the only ones guilty of electoral shenanigans like this. But in this case, their role is all too obvious. A judge issued a preliminary injunction against this law. For the election of 2020, the outcome is still in doubt. Now, are white voters still motivated by this Southern strategy? Well, here's a very interesting set of statistics. Since 1964, the South has been transformed from being the solid South for the Democratic Party into an overwhelmingly conservative and Republican part of the country. In Mississippi, in the election of 2012, only 10% of white voters voted for President Obama. Yeah, I suppose you could claim that race had nothing to do with it. I'm not going to believe you if you do. In Michigan, only about 45% of white voters voted for Obama when he won the state decisively. In fact, President Obama won a majority of the white vote in only 8 states that year out of the 50. Now, and I might add one other thing. The last time a Democrat has won a majority of the white vote was 1964. Now, what is the effect of all this on the social safety net? The network of programs that make it more tolerable for a poor person to function. Now, one measure of this is the Medicaid expansion. This, under the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare, expanded Medicaid coverage to citizens, and it was almost entirely paid for by the federal government. But these states in yellow are those who refused it. And look where they are, most of them. And they have, with no accident, they have some of the highest percentages of African Americans or minorities, in some cases Latinos, in the case of Texas, in their populations. Now, Paul Krugman put it this way. He said, the more blacks, the less compassion white voters feel. All too often, white Americans think of the social safety net not as something for people like themselves fallen on hard times, but as a giveaway to those people. I think the evidence for this is overwhelming, and there will be a link to an article on the last slide of this presentation that will give you some more evidence of that fact. So why doesn't the U.S. have universal health care, as virtually every other industrialized country in the world does? Could race be a main part of the answer? Well, you decide. I think it's clear that, as far as I'm concerned, the answer is yes. Now, let's talk about 4 types of racism. There is racism as hate, open, extreme, often violent. This is the racism of the Ku Klux Klan, for example. And that has, to a certain extent, gone out of fashion in the United States. But that's not the end of the story. There's also structural racism. Look at outcomes, often apart from intentions even. So, for example, what we talked about in an earlier part of this presentation, the fact that the net worth of white families is something like 13 times the net worth of black families. This is a result of policies like the discrimination in home loan financing, going back to the New Deal. It may, but remains because of structures that have existed and in other examples continue to exist. There's also something you could call implicit or common sense racism. For example, in the convict leasing system that you have or will read about in the selection from Slavery by Another Name, people were accused of vagrancy and convicted. And, well, the reaction of a lot of people to this was, after all, they're criminals. Of course, they're given sentences that may involve work. But the reality is that they did nothing wrong. And for more information on that, I'm going to refer you to that selection from Slavery by Another Name. Then finally, there is something you could call strategic racism. It's a deliberate attempt to use race as leverage to get what you want. And here, political ads are very adept at that. Now, in the PDF version of this, there are 5 links to political ads. And I would invite you to follow these links and decide if this is racism. There's much more that we could say about this huge topic, of course. But let's ask one last question. To what extent does racism explain the class divide in our society today and the hostility that so many Americans feel toward the poor? Hostility, or at the very least, indifference. Now, in the PDF version, there are 2 links that we would like you to follow. One is to a study that shows that whites would rather give up social programs that benefit them if they know that minorities get them too. And you can gain a lot more insight about the nature of racism in America by reading this excerpt from Tim Wise's book, Under the Affluence. In the interest of keeping this presentation from getting too long, we'll stop it there and invite you to follow up with these other resources.